Now, candidates that push the big lie, the ones I was just discussing, are winning Republican primaries across the country. People basically mounting their whole campaign on a lie. More and more, the Republican Party is being run by extremists who advocate dismantling the system to meet their ends. But when did this really all begin? Was it with Trump? Author Dana Milbank argues it wasn't the rise of Donald Trump or even the January 6th insurrection. He writes in his latest book that the start of the Republican Party's move to the extreme right can be traced back decades. Joining us now, columnist for The Washington Post, Dana Milbank. He's the author of the new book, The Destructionists, the 25-year crack-up of the Republican Party. Thank you so much for being on. Congratulations on the book. It definitely wasn't Trump that got us here. Many would argue that it was an atmosphere that allowed Trump to take advantage of the situation. Can you describe where this all began?
Well, look, it's going to be to some extent arbitrary, but I take it back to the Republican Revolution of 1994, Newt Gingrich's revolution. You were talking a moment ago about sort of Republicans standing against everything, just sort of throwing sand in the gears of whatever is happening. That's when it really began. The idea is to scream and yell and oppose. That's when the era of shutdowns began, the end of the budgeting. And I actually in the book I talked to way back then in 1998 a young congressman by the name of Joe Scarborough, and he had gotten involved with the coup against Newt. And at one point he said, we have to make a choice. Are we going to govern effectively, or are we going to go into the minority? And I choose to govern. And I think that's exactly what Joe Scarborough was talking about a moment ago. Is his fellow Republicans left him at that point and decided not to govern. They didn't necessarily go into the minority. They did for a period of time. But I think more than that, they realized how they could continue to return to power without representing a majority of the people. But I think that was the beginning of the serious dysfunction we see today. And it got worse in various iterations in the years since then.
Well, Dana, what was so fascinating to me is, at least when I was there were people that believed in balancing the budget. What shocked me is when I went back 5 years later, the guys that were, fighting and politically willing to die for balanced budgets, for budget surplus. I mean, when I left, we had a $155 billion budget surplus. And then you go through the Bush years, the record deficits, record debt. You go through the Trump years, record deficits, record debt. I mean, my God, there was always a harsh side to the rhetoric, but some things actually got done. I mean, as far as there were at least some people who believed in what they claimed to believe. Now there's not even that. It's not about, look at Liz Cheney. It's not about ideology. It's about being in a cult.
Right. I look at Liz Cheney and look at Dick Cheney, who are now would be considered rhinos in the Republican Party, as would Ronald Reagan, as would Mitt Romney and John McCain. Newt Gingrich came to power with an entirely different way of thinking about governing. He wanted to talk about the opponents as corrupt. He wanted to talk about them as cheaters, as anti-patriotic, as anti-American. Republicans of that era coming out of Reagan were for limited government, were for small government. A transition began at that point when it went from being for limited government into being anti-government. You saw a lot of common cause being made with the militias. You heard this on conservative talk radio, sort of edging the white nationalists into the party, what we see in a much larger extent right now. So I would say that it began with that Republican revolution. We saw it, I think, a little bit after the 9/11 attacks, when the politicization of the Iraq War, the lying about the intelligence Iraq. Then we certainly saw it with the Tea Party and the birther movement. And so Trump, against that backdrop, was just really, I mean, look, he was a pro-choice. He was for health care for all. He was all about tolerance and anti-racism. He was at one point campaigning against Pat Buchanan. So he just saw where the Republican Party was going, and he decided, I want to be the drum major, and I'm going to adopt the basket of issues to get out in front of this parade.
So, Walter Isaacson, I know you've got the next question for Dana, but I wonder if the Biden presidency has been at all stabilizing to this. A lot of people wondered, would he be a transitional figure? Would he be able to do more? What do you think Biden has done so far beyond beating Trumpism or Trump himself? Has he been able to push back at Trumpism, which really seems alive and well?
Yeah, I do think that he's uniquely qualified to be a stabilizing person. But in our media landscape and the way everybody gets demonized, it's particularly hard for him to do so. I would hope that he would say, I'm now really going to focus on trying to show that government can work, that we can have a stabilized system. But I want to turn it, if I may, a question to Dana, because I was reading his book last night, and congratulations, Dana. It's actually towel-snapping funny in points, too. But one of the characters in there that I found particularly interesting was Mitch McConnell, and you really do a lot on him. I once read his memoir, years ago, 5 or 6, 7, 8 years ago. I read it, and it was about him standing up to the crazy wing of the Republican Party. And he writes about how people in his own party had come there just to take positions and make stands rather than to govern. What happened? What was this pirouette that would have dazzled Diaghilev that happened to him?
I'm not sure it's as much of a pirouette, Walter, as a gradual transition for him. I mean, look, he came in, was running the Senate re-election campaigns in the late 1990s, and it was essentially saying, putting out ads saying the Democrats are going to bring us into a nuclear war. You have to give us money to stop it. So I don't think there was ever sort of an angelic period of Mitch McConnell. I do think that since the Tea Party and emerging into Trump, he recognized that, hey, if I want to remain the Republican leader and not get passed by the likes of Rand Paul from his home state, he's got to do things differently. Look, I think certainly Mitch McConnell is not ideologically the most nefarious actor by a long shot, but I would argue that he, more than any other single person, enabled the presidency of Donald Trump because he said to the Republican establishment, the Chamber of Commerce, the Country Club Republicans, it's okay, you can donate money. He brought the Republican establishment on board, and of course it's been hijacked. And he's popular inside of his caucus, but he's woefully unpopular outside of his caucus. But you've seen this over and over again, the sort of deal with the devil that establishment Republicans made, and now we're seeing in places like Arizona last week, for example. There is no establishment. The crazies have actually become the establishment.
Dana, let me pick up right on that point, because I think, and congratulations on the book, I think what gives me cause to pause is that the far-right extremists that started maybe before Gingrich but became mainstream in the Gingrich era has seemingly taken over the party, where it's geared toward destroying rather than how they want to govern. I remember being in a room in South Africa after the first election there in '94, and Mandela was lecturing people there saying, we've now got to prove we can govern. They're not about governing, they're about stopping whoever is governing. Right. And on the left, there's been the same fight, but they've not overtaken the party. What do you think the difference is? Why the far left that are destructive have not become the main part of the party, even though you have a party from Joe Biden to Bernie Sanders, but on the right, it seems like the crazies are in charge.
Yeah. Yeah, it certainly does. And Reverend, I think we've been building towards this point for a while. There are various technical reasons. Democrats are more likely to have open primaries, and they haven't been consumed to the same extent. But I think the biggest picture is Republicans are turning against democracy because democracy has turned against Republicans. I think they've lost the popular vote in the last 7 of 8 elections. So basically, the best play is to depress the vote, keep people from going to the polls. That's why you had the aforementioned Mitch McConnell saying we need to make Barack Obama a one-term president, saying we build up a whole litany of failures. We beat him here, we beat him there, and then people get unhappy and upset with the government, and hopefully that redounds in the Republicans' view to their party. So I think that's why I call the book The Destructionist. It's not just destroying by accident; it's doing it for a very deliberate reason, and that is to sow a lack of faith in the government. And believe me, if you look at the Gallup poll on trust in American institutions, they've succeeded admirably well in destroying the trust in the whole range of institutions. Dislike of government has worked to the Republican advantage, as they have continuing to appeal to what is really a minority of the electorate.
So, Dana, I wonder, though, if what you're talking about is actually the destruction is actually what they're doing now is destroying their own party. You read the Wall Street Journal editorial page, certainly not a progressive rag. And what are they talking about? They're talking about how Donald Trump and Trumpism cost Republicans the House in 18, cost Republicans the Senate in 18, cost Republicans the White House in 20. And they say just may cost them the Senate in 22 and the White House again in 24. Because this Americans, look at what's the matter with Kansas? Not a whole lot right now. Are we starting to see the payback for 25 years of deconstruction?
Yeah, I mean, it's all well and good for the Wall Street Journal editorial page to say that after also being enablers of Trump for that period of time. I think what you're seeing, Joe, is, look, and what's underlying a lot of this is this transition to a minority white nation, which will happen in 2045, somewhere around then. So this is sort of the backlash that is occurring against that. So I think that's where most of the Republican actions right now can be seen in that context, a backlash against the growing multicultural America.